You're at that point in your paper where you are working with your sources and you need to figure out how to integrate them into your writing. You're also going to make sure that you do so responsibly. So that means you're citing your sources as you work, but there's different ways that you can work with your sources and integrate them. So I'm going to give you a few examples today of how you can do that. And I'm also going to talk to you about how you shouldn't do it so that you end up with the best paper possible. So to get started today, make sure you have out a piece of paper. And I want you to take that piece of paper and divide it into 4 squares. So fold it in half and then fold it in half again. Make sure you don't write too big so that you have plenty of room to write. And I want you to label each quadrant, so you should have 4 squares now. I want you to label the first one, plagiarize, the second one, patchwrite, the third one, quote or quote it, and the fourth one, paraphrase. Now I want you to write, again, kind of small, what you think each of these words mean. How would you define these words? And if you don't know, write, I don't know. So pause the video here and see if you can define these words. All right, if you're coming back to me, you have attempted to define each of these words. Now I have an example at the very bottom. We're going to work with this excerpt from an article in just a second. Let's see if you were accurate in knowing what each of these words mean. So first of all, you want to make sure that you're weaving everything into your paper very carefully. You've got your own ideas and you're blending them and balancing them with your sources' ideas. You're supporting your ideas with your sources. You want to make sure you don't let your writing become a collection of sound bites. The idea here instead is synthesis. Okay, so decide what you want to write about the topic and then integrate your own ideas into the conversation and make your own connections between and among sources. So let's take a look at those differences. And I do incorporate the word summarize here. We'll talk about that in light of some of the other terms. Now, patchwriting is, you may not have heard of this term before. Let's go ahead and start out with what you don't want to do. So patchwriters are writers who replace some key terms with synonyms. They may delete a few words. They may slightly alter the grammar, but ultimately when they're using their source and they're not direct quoting, they're still not putting the passage fully into fresh words or sentences. We want to avoid patchwriting and plagiarism in our paper. So patchwriting is often associated with plagiarism because even though you maybe even are still giving credit to the source, so maybe you're incorporating the author's name in some kind of way, it's still not fully put fresh into your own words. In other words, patchwriting is poor paraphrasing. My advice to you in avoiding patchwriting is to make sure you understand the material. So make sure you know what you've read. Until you've internalized it, you may be tempted to simply plug in what the author said, maybe because you just don't quite get it just yet. Or you may think, okay, this person's the expert, they said it, I don't understand it as well, so I'll just kind of take what they said and I maybe change the word big to large and call it my own writing. That's not a good idea. Some teachers, again, associate that with plagiarism. So to become a better paraphraser, in other words, to paraphrase is to utilize a source's ideas, but to write it in your own wording. So to do that in a good manner, first of all, you want to close it. So the 4 C's here: close it, compose it, check it, cite it. Close it means I literally close the source. So I've read it, and to not be tempted to use it word for word, I may close the screen, close the book, whatever it is that I'm working with, I put it away. The next step that I do is I compose it. So I then write it in my own words. So I recall in my mind what the source said. I write it in my own words. I compose it. The next thing you'll do is check it. So you can't just write it and be done with it. You really do need to make sure you've kept the author's original intent there. So check it for an accurate translation. If there's some key borrowed terms that really are the author's like true terms, but you can put quotes around those. And then of course the last step is always important, to make sure you've cited it in some kind of way in your sentence, so with the author's name and the date. All right, that's what you would do to avoid patchwriting. So here's an example of patch writing so you can see what I mean. So at the very top, I have the actual just cut and paste of the original source. So if I were opening this book, that's how I would see it. The second example you see here is what we call patch writing. So if you'll look at this, you can see that in red, those are the exact phrasing from the original source. The blue is where I have done that idea of creating synonyms. So, for example, increasingly changed to more and more. Central experts became main experts. And then in the black, I have, besides the citation, in the black, I have my original words. So as the writer, my own words were from, on, and, that, were, and the. So as you can see, I haven't quoted it, but I also haven't paraphrased it. I've patch written. So what you're going to, again, want to do instead is to make sure that you are actually putting it in your own words. So at the bottom is a better paraphrasing. I may still want to kind of work on this one a little bit more. I also want to point out to you that there's certain terms that are going to have to be used in my final example. So if I'm talking about child psychology, I probably have to use the word child psychology. So we're not just talking about saying you have to delete everything that the original author said. It's just the idea of when you paraphrase, you truly want to have your own wording and phrasing. You want to say it in your own way, but you want to keep the author's original intent intact. Make sure that that is there. Quoting is when you incorporate, it's something, you have to be very careful. Quoting is okay, but you want to use it sparingly. You want to do so when something is said so precisely and so well that you feel like the quote is integral to your own writing. You want to make sure the quote is not just plucked out of the original source and then plopped into your work. Instead, you want to make sure it again is integrated into your own writing. To do this, you may want to think of the Oreo cookie method. The Oreo cookie method can be used for both quoting and paraphrasing. So every time you're incorporating information from a source, you want to have that Oreo cookie in mind. So your top cookie is your lead-in. This is where you're going to give context, so tell the reader what you're writing about, and use some sort of signal phrase like according to X, or as X notes, or as X explains. And that's going to be your top cookie. That's where you're leading in. The creamy part is the good stuff, right? That is your good quote word for word, or if you're paraphrasing, this is where you would put it into your own words. And then it's important to remember that bottom cookie. This is your follow-up. You're going to explain what the quote or paraphrase means. You're going to debunk it or interpret it or assess it or add to it or whatever it is you need to do, whatever reason you are actually incorporating that quote. Now, one thing I want to go back to, I haven't talked a whole lot about summarizing because we covered that the first part of the semester. But remember, summarizing, whenever you do that, you still need to make sure you give credit to the author. But that is where you take the original information and condense it, put it in your own words, but the information still comes from a source. Here's an example, though, of that Oreo cookie quote in action in a silly manner here. So the blue is your top cookie or your lead-in. So being yourself is crucial to finding happiness in life, as Lady Gaga explains. Then in red, I have my direct quote. I've set it off with quote marks, and it's word for word. And then I don't forget my bottom cookie, which is my follow-up. So her quote was, "You have to be unique and different and shine your own way." And I followed it up with, "Her wisdom helps many feel empowered." Okay, if you return to your quadrants, here is an excerpt from you're familiar with this, what Americans keep ignoring about Finland's school success. And I have this is just copied and plucked and plopped into this Prezi so that you could work with it. So I'm challenging you now to, in each of those quadrants, see if you can see the difference between paraphrasing, patch writing, quoting, plagiarizing, patch writing, quoting, and paraphrasing. See if you can do that. This may be the only time in the history of your education that your teacher tells you to plagiarize. What would this look like plagiarized? What would it look like patch written? How would you direct quote it using the Oreo cookie method? Don't just put quote marks around it. And what would this look like to you paraphrased? So I challenge you to do this activity so that you can see the difference between all four of these, so that when you write your paper and you're summarizing, paraphrasing, and quoting, you do so in a responsible way and a way that avoids patch writing.